does God exist? Most people seem sure. Some sure that God does exist, others sure that God does not exist. I wish I were sure either way. What makes all these people so sure about God when I am not? What do all these people mean by God? Is God a term of clarity or of muddle? How to define or describe God with any precision? If I could know, then I could ask, is this God? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and closer to truth is my journey to find out. I ponder whether or not God exists, but I do not do well, because I cannot imagine what God might be like. Philosophers claim to think clearly about deep matters. So how do philosophers who believe in God think about God? What kind of God do they think exists? Because my culture privileges the Judeo-Christian tradition and Anglo-American philosophy, I start outside my comfort zone with a distinguished Islamic philosopher. The former head of the Imperial Iranian Academy of Philosophy, now professor at George Washington University, Seyyed Hossein Nasr. Hossein, in trying to understand the meaning of God, I've been speaking to different theologians, but most of them are from the Christian perspective. In order to properly understand God, we need more data points. And I come to you to learn about the Islamic view of God.
Islam, on the one hand, of course, is the third of the three religions we associate with Abrahamic monotheism. The oneness of God, His creative power, and so forth are shared with Christianity and Judaism. But perhaps there's an aspect of the understanding of God in Islam which needs to be emphasized, and that is that, first of all, the assertion of the unity of God in Islam, that is going back to the sacred text of Islam, the Quran, starts with a negation, because in a sense, everything that we say of God is already a way of limiting it. So when you try to peel this off metaphysically and philosophically, you're left with, I would not even say concept, because the concept is closed in upon itself. The divine reality has an aspect which has not participated in creation, you might say, and is even beyond the concept of being. In Sufi metaphysics, this is called Adhat, that is the divine essence. The divine essence has as its first self-determination, first you might say entification, what we call being with a capital B. So God, in the full meaning of the word God, is both in a sense God and the Godhead, beyond even the ordinary idea of God. And the question to ask would be, how do we come to know that there is such a thing? And the answer to that is that although we are created by being, there's something within us which is beyond creation. And we have a kind of uncreated reality at the very center of our being. Now, to come to that beyond being, and even to pure being, which is sort of the point of relationship between us and the beyond being, we have to undo the cosmogonic process. That's why I use the verb to unbecome. One of the grandeurs of the Islamic revelation is the revelation of 99 names revealed in the Quran, in which God reveals himself as those names. For example, not only is God the giver of life, but he's also the taker of life, giver of death. Not only is he merciful, but he's also a judge. The recitation of the names of God bring with them certain power, spiritual power, which play a very important role in the practical aspects, operative aspects of the Islamic revelation. Everybody in the West knows these Indian yogis sitting down and saying Om. That Om is a divine name according to Hinduism. And in Islam, you have this plethora, because they consider itself to be the last revelation of many, many different names, which give us a very full conception of divinity based on revealed sources, not our own theological interpretations. At the same time, many lines of access to God.
The mystery of being and non-being. Beyond being is ultimate. Nothing is greater than beyond being. That, from Islam, I appreciate. Islam's God is wholly transcendent, knowable more as what God is not than as what God is. Yet Islam has those 99 names or attributes of God. Is this God? How do Judeo-Christian descriptions of God compare? I go to Oxford, England, Oriel College, to meet the professor of the philosophy of the Christian religion, Brian Leftow. Brian, what is God? What is the being that is being called out when we wonder, does that exist?
I'd sum it up under two headings. God is the ultimate reality, and he's the absolutely perfect being. Under the heading of its being the ultimate reality, I'd say this: God is that from which absolutely everything else comes and in which everything else has its roots. So I would say even things like logic and mathematics have their roots in God. God is the source of time itself, and so as having made it, he's outside it. God is the reason that there's anything at all rather than nothing, and so I would say that implies that he's a necessary being, not something that just happens to exist. Under the heading of his being the absolutely perfect being, I'd say, well, part of that is that he's perfectly good, also perfectly free. He's perfect in knowledge, so he knows everything. He's perfect in goodness, so he's all good. He's perfect in freedom, so perfectly free. Perfect in power, so omnipotent.
It sounds very nice, but it seems too perfect. And what gives you any confidence that all of those characteristics can conjoin together?
I guess to the extent that I do have some confidence in that, it would come from two sources. One is that I'm a Christian, and I find bases for all those things in the Bible. The other is that I think there's fairly plausible philosophical reasoning to the effect that there has to be a perfect being. That's something that you can accept independent of any commitment to any religious tradition. So I think whether you sort of take the route of revelation or the route of reason, you're going to wind up in pretty much the same place. And also the mere fact that two routes tend to get you to the same destination is also some reason to think that maybe that's the right destination to go to.
Each of those two routes have different kinds of critique that go along with them. Some would critique the whole concept of revelation, but even if you allow revelation, you have many conflicting revelations in the world, and that's a whole other territory. I want to put that aside and focus on reasoning, because the common assumption today among philosophers who are believers is that reasoning, so-called a priori reasoning, that's just pure reasoning without accepting information from the world, while it's interesting and fun, really can't get us to God.
A lot of people do think that. I happen to disagree. I've looked very long at what's called the ontological argument for God's existence, and I think most philosophers would agree that it's a valid argument, at least that certain versions of it are valid. And that's to say there's no logical mistake in it. I'm aware there are many people who disagree with me. I think I can at least give them an argument. You'd have to judge at the end of the day whether it's a good one.
Is this God, as you've described, this perfect being that's outside of time, is that God what we'd call a person?
If what you mean by a person is the sort of thing that we are, no. We are temporal things that change in very many ways, that acquire our information from the world, that are contingent, vulnerable. If you build that into the concept of a person, then that's not what God is. But suppose you start with a very abstract idea. A person is just something with knowledge and will, something that can know things and form intentions and maybe have feelings. Then the answer,
which has a consciousness to it.
Yeah, right. Then
An active consciousness,
right,
not a passive consciousness.
Right.
So the person that you say God is dissimilar to us, but has these characteristics of active consciousness, knowledge, and will. But according to your statement, that God cannot change if God's not in time,
right,
in any respect.
Right.
So God is totally changeless.
Right.
Does that make you happy?
I'm happy with it, mostly because I think there are good arguments for it. I mean, it's not what you hear about in Sunday school originally, but it is, I think, the best picture of God overall.
your confidence level that such a God as you've described exists is where from 0 to 100?
I'd want to make a distinction. On a personal level, I feel very confident, but
Very is...
very as in 0.8, 0.9, that sort of thing. I mean,
Okay.
I've staked my life on it. I'm very comfortable with having done so. As to what the arguments can warrant, I think that doesn't go quite so high. I mean, I think they give you more reason to believe it than to doubt it, but not a whole lot more.
Brian offers two big categories to describe God. Ultimate reality, the ground and cause of all existence. Perfect being, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, all-free. It fits the famous definition of God by Anselm in the 11th century. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Is this God? If so, God is a philosopher's kind of God. I relate to a philosopher's kind of God, but worry. Should God be found through philosophy? That would be odd, because, well, most philosophers do not believe in God. I'm talking to the minority of philosophers who do believe in God. Still in Oxford, I meet a philosopher of religion who argues that religion's moral and spiritual principles take precedence over its theological and doctrinal precepts. John Cottingham.
God is clearly everything that we're not. We are finite, we are mortal. God is taken to be infinite. And we are imperfect, whereas he's taken to be perfect. That already means, I think, that it's very hard for us to grasp the true nature of God. So there's a problem there, of course, because if you emphasize, as I would, the incomprehensibility of God, it perhaps looks as if there's nothing we can very usefully say about God. And indeed, Hume, the atheist philosopher David Hume, said that people who stressed the mystical nature of religious belief weren't very far from atheists. In fact, he said they were atheists without knowing it.
Hume had this phrase, something like the unknown inconceivable properties of God could be the unknown inconceivable properties of the universe. And if people name it God, that's an artificial confidence that they give to themselves when others could just give it to the physical existence.
Yes, but there is a difference, I think, and it's a difference which is clearly manifest in praxis, in practice. The life of the theist is very different in terms of their outlook, their hopes, their attitudes from the life of the atheist, who really typically regards the physical material universe and whatever arises out of it as all that there is. Whereas for the theist, I think the cosmos manifests an underlying divine reality, which is good. So it's not, I think, in any elaborate metaphysical analysis of the nature of God that theism, religious belief, differs from atheism, but rather in the fact that the theist recognizes the universe as somehow manifesting that underlying goodness, the goodness of God.
And yet you've said about this God that we can know nothing about that God. How is that linkage made?
The traditional answer to that has been via the notion of analogy, that there are certain human, as it were, analogies for the properties of God, in particular what we're talking about, the goodness of God. And in Christian terms, the incarnation provides this bridge. In Judaism, of course, it's the Torah, the law, the moral law provides, as it were, the way in which God is manifest in the human and social world. And in Islam, it's the revelation of the Quran. So in both those cases, we're not left, as it were, in pure metaphysical speculation.
You're critical quite of the use of metaphysics.
Yes, it's not that I'm, as it were, against careful metaphysical analysis, but it does seem to me to be curiously beside the point in terms of the way the believer lives and what in fact motivates people to religious belief. The most characteristic reasons for belief are of a more existential kind. They're to do with certain deep needs in the human psyche, in the human spirit. So while not being anti-metaphysics exactly, I'm trying to argue that philosophers should spend more, or at least as much time, in examining these other aspects which are, I think, central to the life of the believer.
To John, since an infinite God is unknowable to finite humans, metaphysical analysis of a spiritual God does not differ much from metaphysical analysis of the physical world. God and religion are best apprehended through personal practice, he says, experiencing God and living the religious life. That requires faith, I assume, in an unknowable God. But does an unknowable God demand too much from faith? Personally, I don't do well with faith. Still, I push. If God is real, shouldn't we know something affirmative of God? Would a theologian say more? Continuing at Oxford, I head over to Regent's Park College to meet a leading Baptist theologian, Paul Fiddes. Paul, all my life I've wanted to know whether God exists, like many people. I follow the debates about the existence of God, but when I sit back, I wonder, what is it? What is that God to which they are all referring? Nobody ever tells me. Can you tell me?
Well, this is, of course, the biggest question of all. I'm not surprised you've been asking it. And it's here that the human mind runs up against its limits, because God is unique. God can't be compared with anything or anyone else in the world. And so some people have said, well, all we can really say is what God is not. And so they look at the world around them and they see things perishing and they say, well, God is not like that. God does not perish. God does not come up against death in that way. And that's all we can do, to speak of God in a negative way. I think it's possible to say positive things about God. We can't speak literally about God, but we can use metaphors, images, pictures, analogies to point to the truth about God. And we can be confident in doing that because God has made us in God's own image, Christians believe. And also, God has disclosed God's self through the whole process of human history to different people at different times. And so, out of that, we can begin to say things about God. And I'd want to say at the very centre of that is that God is love and that God establishes just and right relations.
Now, if you look at the big questions of the universe with 13.5 billion years of history, 100 billion galaxies, that seems like a small thing to be the ultimate ground of being of everything that we see. I don't mean to be insulting, but that sounds too small for me.
Well, if you think love and justice are small things,
I don't say they're
then
small
of course,
things.
You might think in that way.
I'm not saying they're small things for human beings on this earth, among people. It's wonderful. There should be more of it. But to be at the ground of being of all I see in the universe, I need some help in believing that.
Well, this is why Christians think about God in terms of the idea of God as Trinity. Because Trinity is not a mathematical puzzle to be somehow solved, but it's about God living in a communion of relationships, a loving communion of self-giving love. Now, we can think of the whole of the universe as participating in those movements of relationship, of supreme love and justice. And so it does make sense of that vast universe you've described. When we speak about God as Trinity, we're not trying to observe God. This is not an observational language in which we say, well, that's what God looks like then, or we can draw a picture of God in some way. This is a participational kind of language. It's about sharing in God. And the whole universe is engaging in God like this.
Paul does not deny God's supreme characteristics as represented classically, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, and the like. But he does make these perfect being traits subservient to God's overall purpose of participation and engagement, a supreme communion of relations that overflows with love. Is this God? I appreciate the primacy of relations and love, but does it spiritualize away the hard questions about God? How to get at the core concept of God, if there is a God? I asked the Christian theologian Alister McGrath, formerly professor of historical theology at Oxford.
What do we mean by that word? Pascal, as you know, drew this very famous distinction between the God of the philosophers and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And for me, I would want to say that God is not simply a philosophical idea, but rather a dynamic, personal agent who I know not simply as I know an idea, but rather as I know as a friend, as a colleague.
Is the God of the philosophers contradictory or different than this personal friend that you have?
No, it's not contradictory. It's simply one step along a road where there are many more steps to take. In other words, you can say with complete integrity, look, in philosophy, God is a fundamental principle. He's the unmoved mover. And these are good starting points. What I'd want to say, though, is they aren't end points. And I think really for me, the interesting things are what else do you say that takes us beyond the God of philosophers, that actually makes us an existentially interesting and imaginatively powerful vision of God.
If you start with an unmoved mover or the ground of being, well, that's very broad. Maybe we can subscribe to that. But the more you add on to that foundation, the more you create a very specific entity whose existence may be becoming less and less likely.
For me, I think that the real issue is this, that one can believe in a very simple idea of God, but it doesn't really take you very far. And that's the big question. Does the notion of God make a difference? Does it have traction on life? And that's where the real interesting debate begins. It's not simply here as something that might be right intellectually, it's something that impacts existentially as well.
Okay, but the determination of the reality of that gets more difficult the more you add on to that. We agree on that,
we
right?
Agree.
Okay, so the burden of proof becomes heavier on those who would add more characteristics to their concept of God.
Provided that we understand that sometimes the things that are right are actually the more complex things.
Okay, so how do you get to a confidence level that such a being to which you call out to exists?
You begin by saying, look, we want to say that this is not a running away from reality. This is, in effect, coming to a viewpoint which seems to make sense of things and also is deeply existentially significant. From a Christian perspective, we're talking about the idea of revelation. Namely, we don't have to find our way to God, but in some way, God actually discloses himself or makes himself known. So there you have the beginnings of one added layer. Here is a God not simply who exists, but one who says, let me show you what I'm like. It's like, God disclosing himself to Moses. And then God disclosing himself not simply as an idea, but as a person. Let's say not some sort of abstract entity, but rather one who is able to relate to us as I'm relating to you.
Is this God
Something within us.
beyond being,
Which is beyond creation.
God is
ultimate reality and perfect
the
being,
absolutely perfect being.
God is
practice and experience,
we are fine.
And so all the questions...
participation and engagement,
That participation in God.
Does the notion of God
revelation and
does it
relationships?
have traction on life?
Does the metaphysical God of the philosophers clash with the biblical God of Abraham? Is God like an elephant to blind men? Whatever you touch frames your reference. I see two broad categories of understanding God: philosophical, personal. The categories are not symmetrical. For God to be God, God must be the philosopher's God, but only might be a personal God. In other words, if there exists a personal God, that God must have philosophical traits. But if there exists the philosopher's God, that God need not be a personal God. Different descriptions of God can dispirit me. It's what I'd expect if humans created God, not the other way around. Is God made up, or is God a mystery? Only one is closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.